Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Viva Connections and SharePoint Framework bi-weekly sync. It is October the 20th, and I am your host, Garry Trinder. I'm from Microsoft. Let's move forward onto the agenda. So we're going to have a latest update on the SharePoint Framework. We're going to be covering all the latest from patterns and practices. So we'll be talking about PnPjs, CLI for Microsoft 365, and reusable PnP SPFx controls. We're going to have new community samples, and we'll have our optional picture time. So get your camera ready if you want to get involved in that. And today we've got two fantastic demos. We've got Martin first, who's going to be showing copy views in SharePoint Framework web part, and followed by Paolo, who's going to be covering using the Azure AD on behalf of Flow within your SharePoint Framework solution. So there's plenty of opportunities to participate in PnP. You can come on and you can do a demo, you can contribute on GitHub, and you can also give feedback. So if you're working on something incredibly cool, you just want to show that off, obviously get permission before you do that from your company if you're working on that, then get in touch and we can get you on in a slot and give you that opportunity to showcase what you've been working on. Obviously, plenty of repositories that you can contribute to on GitHub, either getting involved, writing code, or just reporting issues and helping out with any problems that people might find, and obviously feedback. So if there's things that we're doing well, not so well, then please let us know. We can just make things absolutely much better than they already are. Okay, so there's plenty of resources for you to find information on how to develop on Microsoft 365. So we've got the official Microsoft 365 developer channel. So go here for new feature updates from Microsoft. We've also got the community channel as well. So the Microsoft 365 platform community YouTube channel is where all of the call recordings go. So we'll publish this call recording 24 hours after the event, and where all the individual sessions are also published as well. As I mentioned, we've got tons of open source repositories that you can get involved in as well. And there's Office Dev, Microsoft Graph, and SharePoint and OneDrive open source repositories as well that you can take a look at. We have tons of sample galleries as well across Teams, SharePoint Framework, Power Platform, list formatting, but we also have the unified sample gallery. So check out that unified gallery and you'll be able to see all of the samples across all those different areas. And if you can't remember any of these links or where to go, the best place to go is to the Microsoft 365 platform community homepage. If you go to aka.ms m365/community, you'll get access to all of these lovely resources. So we have many community calls taking place. We have the weekly Tuesday Microsoft 365 platform call, where we'll have Microsoft employees coming and doing sessions for the community. We've also got other calls that are covering adaptive cards, identity, Office, Power Platform, and obviously this call as well for Viva Connections and SharePoint Framework. So the next Microsoft 365 platform call is on the 25th. We've got 3 sessions. So we've got Sheena Maka, who is going to be showing how to extend Microsoft Teams apps to Office and Outlook mobile. We have Hugo, who's going to be covering the general availability of Power Pages. And we have Vesa and Alex, who's going to be covering using your SharePoint Framework solutions in Teams, Outlook, and Office.com. So 2 sessions there for extending Teams apps into Office and Outlook. So that looks like that's going to be an absolutely great session. Okay, over to David for sharing his caring.
Excellent. Thank you, Garry. Well, friends, as you heard Garry talk about, there is a ton of opportunity to contribute to the community. Many of those are in ways of samples or demonstrating a presentation on this call, perhaps blogging. There's a number of ways, but it can be a little scary sometimes. There's some landscape that you might not be aware of, things like GitHub pull requests and forking, or perhaps speaking for the very first time. We want you to feel comfortable, empowered, and confident. So Sharing is Caring is a program that's going to provide you hands-on guidance. These are live sessions that are going to not be recorded, so they're safe space, and they're going to walk you through how to accomplish many of these things. We are going to be scheduling new dates soon. We really appreciate your patience. There's been a lot of things in the last couple of months, summer, and a number of events that have kind of had our attention. But we're setting up some scaling opportunities. We're setting up some recordings as well, so you can kind of consume that on demand, because we want you to be able to be a part of this community as much as you desire. So don't hesitate to keep an eye on our website, aka.ms/sharingiscaring. Now, once you have contributed, we want to recognize and appreciate in a formal and official way all the work that you're doing, because it is amazing the amount of work that you're all contributing to this community. The recognition program has been set up to just do that. It is powered by Credly, the same Credly that does those certification badges. And in fact, don't miss out on the Hacktoberfest badge. This is a 1 month only available badge here in October for Hacktoberfest. So we definitely want to make sure that you take advantage of that. It's only available once. We do need you to opt in. You're going to see some of those coming out in the next few days as well. We're processing a number of pull requests as fast as we can and getting even more involved to help out. So we appreciate all of your contributions, and this is just one of those ways in which we want to formally and officially show that appreciation, share it on LinkedIn, show it to your consultants, show it to your customers and your managers. You can do that at aka.ms/M365PnP-recognition. Garry, back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, David. Okay, let's move on to Vesa for SharePoint Framework updates.
Quick updates in here. I do have actually some great news, so let's go forward. First of all, all-time the most usage is 2 weeks ago on Tuesday. It's a bit of a strange jump, so we're not sure if that was a real jump or maybe a data glitch somewhere, but it is definitely growing. So if that wasn't the highest usage all-time, it's in this week. So we can see a massive adoption all around the SharePoint Framework usage across the Microsoft 365, which is awesome. Thank you for that. So main announcement for SPFx in Ignite was really the fact, which we're going to actually demo live next Tuesday, is that you can take any SharePoint Framework solution, which works in SharePoint, of course. Previously, we already enabled that same code without any code changes. Key. So same piece of code automatically to be running in the Microsoft Teams without hosting, all of that taken care of. But now we're actually announcing support for Outlook and Office.com. Well, it's not Office.com anymore. Apparently, we have renamed that to be a Microsoft 365 app, but you understand what that is. So basically, exactly the same application now works then across all of the different experiences in Microsoft 365, and it's automatically hosted. It has the automatic single sign-on. It has all of the cost-efficient ways of doing API handling. So really the easiest way to build your Microsoft 365 extensibility. Few news in here. I updated the images and logos. You can now guess on the chat, what are all of those logos? So you can actually recognize all of those logos which are now supported, because 2 of them are completely new, actually 3. But 1.15.2 is the latest for production. 1.16 is actually coming as an updated preview version next week. Most likely it's going to be Tuesday, just before our call or just after the call. And they say that's going to be already a close to GA version of 1.16. We're looking into getting 1.16 out in November, so within upcoming weeks, with great improvements and documentations on how do you get any SharePoint framework to work in Outlook, in Office, or in Teams or in SharePoint, so which is really, really cool. 1.17 is ETA is in the first quarter of 2023, and now we already are finally starting to look into introducing SharePoint Framework V2, which will most likely happen in the second quarter of 2023. So we're looking into making certain changes, not critical changes on the implementation side. So if you have done the implementation of SharePoint Framework solution, that will remain familiar for you, but certain changes on the packaging and messaging and all of that. So we're looking into potentially making finally a V2 announcement with that, but more clarity on that one as we move forward with the upcoming months. But that's it for the SPFx side. So let's move on the open source projects.
Thanks, Vesa. Great updates. Really excited for this to come around. Really looking forward to next week's call. Okay, let's move on to PnPjs. Julie.
Hey. Thank you. We did a release version 3.8 on October 14th. We presented this a couple weeks ago and nothing changed. We didn't add anything new. So this is the same bit of information, just the general documentation updates, updates to caching and searching. We did do some significant improvements on testing. That's still in progress, though. We're going to be doing some more work there. Updates on folders and files, copy by path, move by path. We added some new functionality, file from path and file from absolute path, to make it simpler to move things from one site to another. And and that added ability to get the context info from any SP queryable derived object. So that's like .list. List is an SP queryable type object. So then you can get context info, which tells you what that path is actually going to access. So that is a handy new feature. We are working on some new stuff for the next release, and don't forget about those nightly builds. So anytime a pull request is merged, you can go check out the at PnP SP or at PnP/graph at V3 nightly version, and that will be the latest build based on all the pull requests that are in before release. So if you do a pull request and you want to validate it, or you see a pull request merge that you want to check out the V3 nightly build. And then, as always, follow us on M365 PnPjs on Twitter. And that is all I have. Back to you, Garry.
Great, thanks, Julie. Okay, moving on, CLI for Microsoft 365. So this is me. Okay, so we've just released 5.9 beta, and we've got tons of updates. It is Hacktoberfest, and lots of people have been getting involved. We have lots of activity on the repo, so there's tons of new commands, mainly for Power Platform, so support for retrieving cards, tables, solutions, and tenant settings. We've got tons more issues in the list to enhance these scenarios for Power Platform. So if you're interested, please check out the repo. We've also got new commands for SharePoint Online, so removing event receivers, and more commands for managing file and folder permissions as well. And we've had a slight enhancement to being able to filter shared Teams channels when you're retrieving them from the command. But there is a whole load more of kind of small changes as well. So please do check out the release notes for the full list of all the changes. So if you wanted to use the new beta version, so use the @next tag. So you can install that through npm, or you can use our Docker container as well. Contact us at CLI Microsoft 365 on Twitter. Get in touch with us on the repo. And if you are on Discord and you haven't joined our Discord server, then please, come in, have a chat. There's the invite link on the presentation. Just get involved in the chat, and more importantly, get involved in the server, because we have a birthday party coming up. So the CLI is 5 years old in November, so we're going to have a nice little event. So if you've been working on the CLI, we'd love it if you could come and join us and have a bit of a celebration. There may be cake, there will definitely be snacks. And another reminder as well that we've got our V6 release scheduled around November as well. So with that, let's move on to SharePoint Framework Reusable Components. Alex.
Yeah, so nothing new this time. So we are still on 3.11.0 for React controls and 3.10 for property controls. Still, thanks to everybody who is contributing to our success and to the success of SPFx controls. So, yep, that's all we have.
Fantastic. Thank you for that update. Okay, moving on to PnP Modern Search. So a new release, 4.8.0 beta for September 2022. So thank you to Emily K, Dave, and Paolo for getting involved in there. So there's support now for actionable adaptive cards, and again, check out the release notes for all the details on that as well. Moving on to SharePoint Framework samples. So Hugo's not in the call today, so I'll just cover this one. So yeah, if you do have any samples, like I mentioned at the beginning, we're always interested to understand what you've been working on. So if you have anything to share, then it's a great way to contribute to the community. So check out the unified samples gallery. If you have a sample that you want to share, don't quite know how to do it, check out the Caring is Sharing initiative as well and get that shared with the rest of the community.
Now, Garry, quick point from my side in here. We're a bit delayed on processing some of the pull requests, so we do apologize, especially on SPFx samples. We are trying to catch up. There's a lot of contributions already pending, and we have to apologize on the delay. We've been in the really busy conference season, but we're catching up. We'll get them processed. Thank you for everybody.
Fantastic. Okay, moving on. Picture time.
Cool. And so let me share my screen. A lot of Patricks on the screen. So let me do that. There we go. Now we're getting there. So we have 50 seats in the room. Few more seats. Let's wait. I will show you the timer when we start recording. I guess we're hitting the 50 seats. Let's get moving. We'll get to 3, 2, 1. And action. Thanks everybody for joining. Really cool to have you once again on the call. Thank you for being part of this. And please remember to give us feedback because we are building this solution for you. So thanks everybody. Awesome. And awesome looking virtual people in the room as well. So that's really cool. Thank you. Let's get back on the slides. Garry, back to you.
There we go. Demo time. So exactly what everyone was here for. So first demo coming up, we have Martin, Copy Views SharePoint Framework web part. Take it away.
Yes. Hi. I think I will just share my screen. Wait a second. So good afternoon, at least in this part of the world. This is Martin Linkstar from the Netherlands speaking. I'm a Microsoft 365 architect at a small company in Holland called R4U Business Solutions. I'm also an Microsoft MVP since like 2 weeks now, which is an awesome being honored in that way for what I've been doing in the community. I'm a family man. I love cycling, and if you want to contact me, you can contact me through Twitter, GitHub, or using my blog. Be welcome to ask any questions. I've got this. I built an SPFx sample recently, and I'd like to demo for you how this is working. So the idea is that SharePoint currently has this great features to create new sites based on existing sites, which is awesome functionality. But we had a customer that would really like to allow users to copy views across sites and across lists and libraries towards other lists and libraries. So if you are a user and you have changed a single view, you would like to be able to copy that view and get your changes on the other lists as well. So the question was what it will copy. Well, it will copy which columns are visible. It will copy sorting mechanisms, grouping by group by. It will copy view formatting. It will copy filtering, stuff like that. But when a column is missing in the target list, so for example, you've got a list with a lot of columns, and one of those columns is on your view, and you're copying the view, and if that column is not available on the target list, that part of the view must not be copied. So the view must, of course, render valid and not invalid because there's some column missing. So this is basically the scenario. We build it. I build it. Let's say that like that. I build it as a web part and an extension. So there's a lot of shared code in this sample. You can use it as web part just to set it in the central place to allow people to manage their views, or you can just use it from your lists and libraries and copy your views just very quickly. Let me just show you how it works. I'll just switch to my other screen. This is my dev tenant, and I've got this sample site with a sample document library, and this document library has got a very nice view. I've even called it a nice view. It's got a choice column and it's got some view formatting. And I have this copy views button right in the command bar. This is the list view extension sample. So if I click it, okay, so the demo goals are not really favorable to me. I'm not seeing any errors. It just won't open. Let me just try if I can do it like this. Okay, so I've got this web part right on my screen. As you can see, not as an extension, but as a web part, and I have my current site selected. I can select a list or library. Let's select a documents library, and I can select a view that I want to copy. So let me select a nice view. Let me select a target list and click copy. And it will just copy the view as you see, and it will give you a nice view on the status of the actual copying. So this is basically what you can do with it. So for the list view extension works in exactly the same way, but it will open a dialog. And I've literally used this hundreds of times last week. So it's a bit odd that it wouldn't work on the call today, but well, that's just, if you'd like to try it, download the sample and try it out yourself. Let me get back to the slide. So let me talk a bit about the component structure. So I'm using for this sample, I've used the class components, which is like the classic way of using React in TypeScript, the class components. And there's this big component, the parent component is called the copy views container. And within the copy views container, we've got a few child components, the source list view and the target list view form. And within those, we've got a few pickers. So we've got a source site picker, source list picker, list view picker, switchbox, and target list picker. Every time I change one of the values of one of the pickers, they'll communicate the value of that picker back to the central copy views container. And when I click the copy button, which is right on the right left, it will start copying the tasks. So basically, if you've got the structure of the React components, we are passing props and default values down through the pickers, and we're passing the choices back up through functions. And then in the end, if you click the copy button, which is a primary button from the Fluence UI repository, it will start copying stuff. So as soon as you click the copy view button, another component is rendered. It's the copy status component, and it will show a list of all tasks, and it will show also the status of that list using all kinds of default Fluence UI components. So important to notice that one copy task equals one source view and one target list. So if you're copying two views across to two lists, you'll see 4 tasks in this screen. And you can also click through to view how it's updated your target list. So let's get to some code. So this is basically what happens when you start the copy process. So as soon as I'm clicking the copy button, there's a list of tasks that will be created, and it will start a parallel execution using parallel promise.all. And as soon as a task is successful, it will just update the state of the task, and that will immediately be visible on the screen by nice check marks. So now onto the what's really going on below. We're using PnPjs to do the actual copying. So the first thing we do is to get everything we need. So we need some information from the source list. We need the view, we need the fields, and we need some information from the target list as well. So we need to know what fields are on there to be able to exclude fields that are not available on the target list. We need to see if the view is already available, so we can update it instead of add it. And as soon as we have all the information, we are going to build a properties object. And as you can see here, if you've worked with REST API or with PnPjs or with any SDK against SharePoint, you'll notice and recognize a lot of these properties. So there's a lot of classic view properties like row limit, hidden, includes root folder. All those things are being updated on the target. All those things are being updated on the target list. And there's also some more modern properties like custom formatter and view type 2, which are being updated. And but the most important one, of course, is the view query, because that's That's a camel query, and that's the most complex one to update. And I'll show you a bit, because view filter query is basically a camel query, so that might have the following structure. It shows a bit of XML, group by part, an order by part, and a condition, a part with a condition. And this might be very, very long, of course. I mean, if you have multiple and or conditions, there might be a very deep structure visible here. And in the end, if you have some column that only exists on my source list, then this view query needs to be parsed and needs to be changed. It needs to be changed, for example, if that column, some column that only exists on source list, if we have to remove that, it will need to look like the following on the right-hand side of the screen. You know, the eventual view query that we use needs to be cleaned up, and things, field references need to be removed, etc. So how can we do that? I used the DOM parser for it. So I looked into a lot of options. You've got a few things like XML2JS, which can parse XML. But in the end, I decided, because we're running in a browser, and we can use the DOM parser API, which is a regular browser API, that you can parse a XML string and update it. And so basically what we're doing is just parse the XML of the view query. I'm adding a root element, because that's not available by default in the view query property of the view. I'm parsing it as XML, and I'm going to remove some references and update the structure of the view query. So you can do a lot with the DOM parser. For example, if you got the reference camel, I'm doing things like get all elements by tag name, so that I have all the field references, so I can check if fields are in the camel that are not on the target list. I can check, if I've got a field ref, is there a value node right next to it using next element sibling. I can remove those elements just from the camel, from the XML elements. And I can also replace things. So basically, what I'm doing, what I'm doing is I check out what field references are in the camel. I remove the field reference that are not available on the target list. I'm also removing value elements that are not on that are the sibling of those field references, and then I'm just cleaning it up. And now, of course, if you've got an AND or an OR condition, you need to there's an AND or condition always has two children, so you need to check if one of those children is removed, you need to collapse the structure a bit, which is what I did as well. So basically, if you've got some column that is missing, the entire camel is being reformed into a very simple, a more simple camel, and it will just work. It will just show how it should be. So that's basically what I did using the DOM parser. And well, if you've got the properties object with the new view query, we can just call SharePoint using PnPjs and add the view or update the view. And after adding or updating the view, we also have to update the view fields, which is a separate action. So we create a list of fields. We just remove the existing fields and add the new fields to the view. So what's currently not supported for this web part is the more modern Kanban and modern calendar type of views. I'm thinking, if you like to contribute, maybe you would like to pick this up. Kanban boards and modern calendar type boards, I did not support them in the first version because they require you to add a field as well. For example, the Kanban boards depends on a column with a few values. In this case, test bucket. So it will manage the buckets of the view. So you would need to add the field as well, instead of what I'm currently doing is not doing anything with fields, just only creating and updating the view itself. But I'm open to. We're all open to contributions. So if you'd like, do pick it up. That's that's all for now. I've got a few resource links if you like to look at it. The samples in the samples repository. PnPjs, if you haven't worked with it, do try. It's an awesome library to use to communicate to SharePoint, and well, some documentation for the DOM parser API. That's it, Garry. Back to you.
Excellent demo. Thank you very much, Martin. Lots of claps and love hearts. It's definitely gone down very well. Thank you for coming on and sharing that with us. Moving on to Paolo. So Paolo's going to go through using Azure AD on behalf of Flow within your SharePoint Framework solution. Take it away.
Yes, thank you, Garry. And yes, we are going to talk about how we can leverage the on-behalf flow, grant flow in SharePoint Framework solutions. I'm Paolo Pialorsi from pjs.com, and here you can find my reference on Twitter. So first of all, I will start with some theory, just to better understand what we are going to talk about and to be sure that we are all on the same page. And then we will see how we can use the on-behalf flow in a SharePoint framework. So the idea of the on-behalf flow is just to have yet another option, yet another mode to get an access token in order to consume a backend API through Azure Active Directory when we are using a middleware and we want to consume from that middleware a backend API. So the idea is we have a front end. The front end will rely on a middleware, providing an access token to access an API or a service in the middleware. And in there, in the middleware, we will be able to get yet another access token on behalf of, as the name implies, on behalf of the user, which is in the front end, which is consuming the front end, so that we will be able to consume a backend API, which could be, for example, Microsoft Graph or any other kind of API of your choice, as long as it will be registered in Azure Active Directory. And this will make easy and simple, hopefully simple, to have access to a backend infrastructure of services on behalf of the user from a middleware. Just to try to be more clear, I have a diagram which will explain you how the on-behalf flow works from a functional point of view. So imagine that we have an application where we have an end user consuming that application, and we want to consume a backend service or a backend API through a middleware, leveraging the identity platform in between, the Microsoft Identity Platform in between. So the idea of the OBO flow is that the application will provide or will send a request to the middleware, providing an access token for the middleware. Indeed, in this diagram, I am already talking about a scenario where the user already authenticated and already got an access token for the middleware API. Once we provide the access token to the middleware API, the middleware API will provide that access token together with a client ID and a secret. So with the client credentials authentication model from an app point of view, will provide the access token, the client ID, and the secret to the Microsoft Identity Platform in order to get back another access token, which will be an access token which will allow the middleware to consume the backend on behalf of the user who is consuming the application in the front end. And as such, the backend API will be able to provide a result back to the middleware as it was the user in the front end making that request. And as such, we can leverage the delegated model and we can get access to information like the mailbox, the personal data of the user. We can send messages on behalf of the user and stuff like that. That's the idea, the basic idea of the on-behalf flow. When we do that, and generally speaking, whenever we consume an API using Azure Active Directory, there is also the need for a grant for the permission in order to have the application consuming an API on behalf of a user to be granted to do that. So how does it work when we have a middleware in between and we use the on-behalf flow in order to consume a backend API? Because indeed, when we use a diagram like the one that I just showed you, we cannot have a dialogue prompting the user to grant permissions for the middleware to access the backend. So how does it work? Well, there are a few options available. One is to define in the manifest definition of the middleware the fact that there will be a known client application for our middleware, so that when the front end will make a request for an access token, the very first time for an access token to consume the middleware, the end user will be prompted not only to grant access to the middleware, but also to grant the consent to access the resources and the services in the backend through the middleware. And that's one option. Another option is to use the pre-authorized application section of the manifest, which will simply define what are the applications that are pre-authorized with a grant for some specific permissions. Or a third option that we have is the so-called admin consent, meaning that an administrator of our tenant, a tenant admin, will grant tenant-wide the permissions to the middleware to call a backend API, which is, for example, the scenario that I'm using in the demo that I'm going to show you right now. So how does this relate to SharePoint Framework? Because what I said so far is just related to Azure AD, to open authorization, and to consuming an API. Well, what if we want to try to use this model in SharePoint Framework, and why it is worth being able to do that? Well, first of all, let's start with a trivial question, let me say. In SharePoint Framework, we already have the MS Graph client and the AD HTTP client available. So it should eventually be enough in order to being able to rely on a backend API. So let's say you want to use Microsoft Graph. Well, you can easily do that in SharePoint Framework using the MS Graph client and making a REST request targeting the Microsoft Graph. However, when we do that in SharePoint Framework, we need to declare in the configuration of our solution, in the Web API permission request sections of the configuration, we need to declare that we want to have specific permissions for our SharePoint Framework solution. And by default, those permissions will be actually granted to all of the SharePoint Framework solutions running in our tenant, unless we use a domain-isolated web part. Moreover, whenever we use and whenever we consume a backend API from SharePoint Framework, we are actually running code which is running in the browser, meaning that if the user will close the browser, whatever we were doing with our client-side code will stop doing that, because the browser will not exist anymore as an instance. So what if we need to do something which will need additional processing time, or if we need to run long-running processes in the background, but we still want to do that on behalf of the user consuming our web part or our SharePoint Framework solution? Well, with the on behalf of flow, we can do that. So we can, first of all, rely on a middleware, which will be able to verify and eventually grant or not grant the permissions to do something based on who is calling the middleware, rather than just giving the permission to use that API to any SharePoint Framework solution running in a tenant. And secondly, and I would say more importantly, we can also run background tasks and processes on behalf of the user, which will be processes and tasks triggered from the SharePoint Framework UI, but then executed in the background in a background service running in the middleware. So I think this is a really interesting scenario. And that's why now I'm moving to the demo environment, and I'm going to show you how you can implement that. So first of all, let me share with you that the sample that I'm going to share right now is already available in the sample solution gallery, in the unified gallery that we have under adoption.microsoft.com. In this point in time, it is the very first one because I published it literally today, but it will become always available through this link, which I'm going to share in the chat. And here you can get access to the GitHub repo where you can find the source code, and you can find additional documentation. That said, let me move to the actual demo. So first of all, let's see the user experience. This is a very simple and trivial solution because the goal is to show you how to leverage the on-behalf flow model and not to create a really fancy SharePoint Framework web part. But this web part will allow us to specify the URL of a backend middleware, and through that backend middleware, I will be able to make a couple of requests. One will be a simple one, which will simply give me back who I am as an end user, so that I can see that we can read that information through the on behalf of flow access token, as well as will give me back information about how many unread messages I have in my inbox, which could be another interesting information to get. The second part of the demo will still rely on the same architecture, but I will show you a different implementation technique, which is a little bit better and more complete, but a bit more complex to understand as the very first example, and that's why it will be the second one, through which we can send a message in a one-to-one chat in Teams, still using Micrograph through a middleware application. So let me click first of all on the first button, and as you will see, I will be able to get back that I am who I am right now in my tenant, and I can see that I have a bunch of unread messages in my inbox. I can also use this solution to send a message, for example, to my colleague Guido. Let me search for him, and I can send a message. Hi, Guido. All good there. And I can send a message in Teams. In Teams, I have a chat open with my colleague Guido, and as soon as I will press the button, we will see that we will have a new message popping up in the one-to-one chat. Okay, so as I said, this can be easily done also with MS Graph Client, but the key point here is that we are relying on a middleware, so we can do that, for example, in a background tasks or stuff like that. So how does it work? First of all, in Azure Active Directory, we have an application registered, which is in my scenario called SPFx OBO middleware. And in this application, the key information, the key settings you need to be fully focused on are, first of all, the application relies on a client secret because, as I said, in order to get an OBO, sorry, I keep on saying OBO, which is the acronym of on behalf of flow, sorry about that. But if you want to get an OBO access token, you need to use the client credentials. So a client ID and a client secret together with the access token that the middleware has got from the consumer. And so we need to have a client secret. Secondly, in the API permission section of the middleware application, we need to declare the permissions that we need in order to consume the backend API. In my sample, the backend API is Micrograph. So here I need to read the user, user.read, read the mail, mail.read. So we need to being able to create a chat, the one-to-one chat between me and the target user. So I need the chat.create permission for Teams. And I want to send a message, so chat.readWrite, still from a Teams point of view. Plus I have the user.read.all because I need to read the information of the user that I want to involve in the chat that I'm going to create. So these are the permissions that I need. As you can see, these are all delegated permissions. So they will be applied in order to execute as someone, as a user, so on behalf of a user. And we have the grant, the tenant admin grant for all of these permissions, and specifically the one that really needs the admin consent is the user.read.all. Now, this is my middleware, and I want to be able to consume this middleware from SharePoint Framework. And that's why, and this is the third and last step in the configuration of my application, in the expose an API of my middleware application in Azure AD, I also declare that I have a unique application ID URI, which I would advise you to use as a string and not as a GUID like the auto-generated one. So I usually replace the auto-generated GUID with a name which is better recognizable whenever you will need it. My scenario, API, and then SPFx OBO middleware. And then I have a permission scope. You can easily create one more by clicking on Add a Scope and providing all of the information. And this will be the permission that SharePoint Framework will need in order to consume my middleware. And then my middleware in the backend will rely on these permissions on behalf of the user to consume Micrograph in the backend. Okay, so that's it from the Azure AD application registered as the middleware. Now, let's move to the SharePoint Framework solution. And step by step, we will go through all of the layers of the solution. Here we have the web part we saw before. This is a really simple web part, as I told you. The only interesting thing that I do in the web part is in the onInit method, I create through the AD HTTP client factory a client, so an instance of the AD HTTP client object, in order to consume my API. And as you can recognize here, this is the app unique ID or URI that I just showed you in the expose an API section of my application. And that's why I want to use a string and not a GUID, because the string can be the same on multiple tenants. The GUID will change on every single and different tenant. So here I simply say, okay, give me a client, an AD HTTP client, to consume that specific API. And then I provide the instance of the middleware client as one of the properties to my React component, which I use to render the actual UI of my web part. So in the web part, I simply have a really trivial UI where I have a couple of buttons and the people picker from the MGT, because why not, and a text field and a button. So the primary button, the one that I use to just get my personal data, will rely on the get personal data method. Wondering what? Okay, so the get personal data will simply build the URL of the target API based on the base URL that we have in the settings of our web part. So this one, right now I'm running the local version of my function to show you in debug what will happen under the cover. And I have that I make a GET request for that specific URL, and I will get back a JSON response through which I can see who am I, the inbox unread item, and the inbox total item count. Simple as that, okay? When I do this request, under the cover, what happens? Let me do it again with F12. I can see in the network, oops, one more time, sorry, I make a request for get personal data. I target this endpoint in my Azure function, which is running locally in my Visual Studio Code in debug mode. And if I scroll a little bit down, I can see in the authorization header that I have a bearer access token, which is the one generated by the plumbing in SharePoint Framework to give me an access token to consume the target middleware. In fact, if I copy and paste that access token right here, we can see that right now I have an access token for this audience, so for my middleware, and the permission that I have, the scope that I have is middleware.consume, which is the scope that I declared in the expose an API section of my middleware application. Okay, hopefully so far so good. Now, what happens is that when I make a request, and let me do that, let me put a breakpoint in my Azure function. Here I have an Azure function built with .NET 6 isolated mode. I have my Azure function running in Visual Studio Code, and here I can put a breakpoint to show you what happens under the cover. So let me make one more request. Oops, right here. And let me move to Visual Studio Code. And here we can see that, okay, I see that I got my call. I can see if I have an authorization header in the request, and if not, I will complain and say you are not authorized. If I have one, I will get the bearer token that I've just got from the request, from the client request, and I can rely on a utility function that I created, which will give me access to the on behalf of flow token. So let me put a breakpoint right here, and let me show you what happens. So we get the client ID, the tenant ID, the client secret, and then the scopes for the permission that we want to have inside the OBO token. And then we rely on the MSAL library, the Microsoft Authentication Library. And we say, create a confidential client application, which is a specific model of client application we have in MSAL, which is useful whenever we want to use the client credentials model. So client ID and client secret. And that's why I say, create one for my client ID for that specific tenant ID with a specific client secret, which is the one I configured in Azure AD. And once I've done that, once I have my confidential client application created, I can say, okay, let's create a user assertion based on the token that I've got from the front end. So basically, I get the access token that was provided to me by SharePoint Framework, and I will use it to make a new request for a new access token, which will be on behalf of the user, but it will be a different one. And in fact, if I go here and I copy the value of my access token, and I show you again with jwt.ms, here we can see, removing the quotes, that we have a different access token where now the audience is Microsoft Graph. This is the unique ID of Microsoft Graph everywhere in the world. So that's why I know it is Graph. And the app consuming it is my middleware. It is doing that on behalf of myself. And here I can see the permission scopes that I have for Microsoft Graph. So this is a fresh new token, which will allow my middleware to run on behalf of myself in the front end. Okay? So most likely now it will be a timeout, but I don't care if it will be the case. I get the access token, the new one, the OBO one, and I make a graph request using the Graph SDK. And I will not dig into the Graph SDK code right now because we are talking about something else, and I don't want to put too many topics on the table. So we made our request, and we have got our information, the user principal name of the user and the number of unread messages in the inbox. So this is the round trip that we make in order to rely on the OBO flow. Now, it is quite a journey. I mean, for example, if you think about the function, well, in the function, you have to retrieve the access token. You should validate the access token. Then you have to retrieve the OBO token. You have to provide it back to Microsoft Graph. So quite a tough journey, I would say. So just for the sake of making our life easier, in the sample that you can download from the sample gallery, you can also find this additional function, which is the send Teams chat message. In this one, I implemented for you also based on another community sample, which I slightly changed and I wouldn't say improved, but I would say adapted to my scenario. Okay, I made it possible to have an attribute, which is called function authorize, which you can place on top of your function, and where you can declare what the scope are that are required to being able to call, to invoke this function, first of all. And secondly, you can declare if you want to have the on-behalf flow available, meaning that by setting this flag to true, you will easily get in the code of your function access to the OBO flow token without the need to do all of the stuff that I showed you before manually, because you can just rely on this functionality, which will be based on the middleware functionalities of the Azure Functions engine. This is not a session about the Azure Functions, so I will not dig into it, but you can just see that I can set this flag and say, okay, from the function context, give me the principal of the user and give me the on behalf of token, and that's it, and then you can use it. So again, feel free to download the sample and dig into it. I will not dig into the internal implementation of this functionality, but I think this will be really useful for you to easily and quickly be on board of this new scenario. Now, last thing that I want to share with you before giving the stage back to Garry is that if you want to do that for real in a real solution, you will have to host your Azure function, for example, in a real hosting environment in Azure. And as such, if you will do that, remember that you have to configure the course settings in order to have your SharePoint Online tenant in the list of allowed origins for course for your Azure function. Otherwise, it will not work because of course-related issues. So that said, I think it is quite a long journey to see all of the steps, but thanks God we have the recording, so you can go through it again step by step. And I think this is a really useful scenario whenever you want to have a background task running on behalf of the user, and when the user will trigger it from SharePoint Framework. That said, back to you, Garry, and thank you.
Paolo, before you stop sharing,
yeah, sure.
I'm going to jump with the one question. Can you go back on the UX in here? And as you actually showed, yeah, as you showed in here, this is a good thing to just to remind, because we need to be thoughtful about the security and permissions and everything else. The token is visible in here, and that means that if for whatever reason there would be a situation that in the same browser window and session there would be malicious code, potentially that code could actually get access on this token, right?
Yeah, right. That's correct.
We need to be, so that sounds, oh my God, terrifying. Well, yes and no. You can only have that level of a component in your page if you have installed a SharePoint Framework solution to your tenant without knowing what that solution does. So you're basically, as a tenant administrator, that's why we always remind people, you need to know what's in the solution. so that we don't have this theoretical security concern where you have malicious code installed by a tenant administrator, and then it violates and sneaks out potential tokens from other web parts. So it's cool to call out that, of course, we need to know what things we're installing to our tenant app catalog. It's super important.
Yeah, and that's why, for example, in the SharePoint Framework solution, and I forgot to tell it, so thank you, Vesa, because you reminded it to me implicitly by saying what you said. I have to declare in the Web API permission request that I want to allow the SharePoint Framework solution to have access to my middleware in order to have this permission scope middleware consume. And a tenant admin of SharePoint will have to grant this permission in order to make it possible to happen. So thank you, Vesa, for the reminder.
Cool. Good.
And that's it for now for sure. That's it for me. Thank you. And back to you, Garry.
Thanks, Paolo. Absolutely fantastic demo. I really enjoyed that one. I'm sure, I'll be checking out the sample and the recording definitely when it arrives. Right, so thank you to Paolo and to Martin. So this recording of the call will be available in 24 hours. That will be published on the Microsoft 365 community YouTube channel. So if you're not subscribed to get that update, then please do go along and subscribe today and follow for all the latest news at Microsoft 365 Dev and at M365 PnP. The next call that we have will be November the 3rd, and our next Power Platform call will be next week. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Hope you had a great call. See you in 2 weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.